Well, with the guys.
Yeah.
Because we weren't close, and you'd have to walk just to walk to get to like where Michael and Jose were. It was a 20-minute uphill walk
I am
every day.
mic'd.
I am not mic'd.
Do you
So
want?
I will just talk.
You want mine?
Can anyone not hear me? All right. I'm very brief. I'm Nanette Macy-Jones. I'm a board member at the Historical Society. Welcome. And I'm currently really Chuck's assistant as the program chair. What I do. We are welcoming tonight to sort of a double program with Gill Wright Miller, who is going to speak to us about the resilient life of Lorinda Munson Bryant. Gill is well known in our community. She is descended from more than one founding family of Granville, correct?
Well, there was a lot of intermarriage there at the beginning, we're going to say.
The Hilliards, the Wrights, and the Coolies.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she is truly Granville. She holds a PhD in Women's and Gender Studies, and she has taught at a number of places, but most of us know her as a professor at Denison for more than 40 years now, retired like Nanette. She is the author of several presentations and books. One that is very dear to my heart is If These Walls Could Talk, which is her book on Monomoy Place, and Request to Spare Shady Side, which was about the William Wright House. She's currently working on a genealogical project for her family. We talked about that quite a bit with me. I've heard about it.
Yeah.
So we're really honored that she's here. So she is our primary speaker for the evening. She will be at the very end after Gill presents. We are really honored to have Roy. There you are, Fred.
Oh,
Fred,
you're not. It's not an honor.
Fred, put your hand
You're
up.
mistaken.
Fred is Fred Procklin, who is the conservator for our beautiful portrait of Lorinda. He did all the work on it. We also had a young frame conservator work on the frame for us. This painting has been with us many years. It was over on a rack over at the Old Academy building at the OAB.
Oh, don't take my paper.
And, okay. And no. And so we decided we got a great grant and also raised money to have it conserved.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's here in a place of honor. So you're going to learn about her life and you're going to learn about what we did with the picture. I did want to tell you about our next program so you can get it on your calendar. Our next program is on October 29th, so right around Halloween. And it is going to be about, we're redoing the garden out front of the building with indigenous Ohio plants. And we're going to have a duo speak to us, Patty Shipley, who is with Leaves for Wildlife, which is a native nursery. And because of our dear Lynn Overholzer, we are going to have Hope Tapp come over as well. So our former First Lady. So two great speakers on October 29th. And without further ado, Gill, there you go.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not great at technology, so I may have to ask for your patience. But I just wanted to first start by thanking the Granville Historical Society, and particularly Nanette and Christina Gray, because they enticed me to come see the basement of the old Academy building, where that painting happened to have been stored at the time. And then they invited me to think further about who the subject of the painting was. So that is the reason that I'm here. They knew, I think, that my entire academic career was based on two different kinds of stories. One of them was the stories of regular houses, not so much through its architecture, but through its inhabitants. And the other was stories of regular women, not through their husbands, but actually through their own passions. So I was really interested in, I don't want to use the word upgrading, but in thinking more thoroughly about what was the other half of the population doing. And if you read somebody like Bushnell, you'll see that the women are mentioned, their names are mentioned all the time, but the stories are being told primarily about their husbands. And so I've always been interested in that. And this particular painting, let's see if I can figure out the technology. This painting, which happens to be behind you, and so at some moment we're going to get up and take a look at it, but it was stored in that basement, and I started wondering who was this woman. Not what was her name, that was on the back of the painting. So we knew who she was, and we knew she was Charles Bryant's wife. But I wanted to know, like, who really was she, and what was she doing in the basement? Why was this woman in the basement? I'm thinking about yellow wallpaper and Charlotte Gilman. Anyway, Perkins. So, um, but I think that it's important for us to start to look at these women individually. It's very hard to trace some of this information down. You can track it so far, and then you hit sort of stumbling blocks where they're not spoken about in great detail. So I was really interested in her. Her own personal journey is still being amassed. So this is a bit of this is a work in progress, and it's a conversation that we can have. I stand corrected. There are lots of little, I don't know what you call those posters that are around the painting over there that give little snippets of things about what she did. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on tonight was that we discovered that she was really indebted to our founding fathers in Granville because they believed so wholeheartedly in formal education for women. Absolutely, unequivocally. In fact, this is not my paper, but in fact, Denison, was claims 1831 founded for men, but the women's educational endeavors they were only 7 months later, and 1831 that was December, and it was only 7 months later that the women's schools started opening. So I think they were pretty simultaneous when you're talking about having a long, hard winter. So Lorinda here was took advantage of that education, and she also happened to come with the confidence absorbed from being raised in an intellectual family. I'll talk about that, and the independence that she learned by witnessing many, I call them untethered women in her family who had to figure out how to stand up on their own 2 feet. She had plenty of women very close to her that she was witnessing. So she had a much larger self who far exceeded the societal norms and the behaviors considered appropriate for women in the 19th century. After the untimely death of her husband, she was 31 years old, and she straightened out her husband's business affairs. We'll talk about that a little later. And then she built an independent life as a pharmacist, as an educator, and as an author. So she was a very portrait of resilience. Now, this is the GHS, so I'm going to start with some genealogy. Lorinda's father, and I've made a little chart because some people are really not that interested in this kind of genealogy, but I happen to be. So I made a little chart to help you track what I'm saying here. But Lorinda's father was Marvin Morgan Munson. Love that. And he was born in Granville, the son of Augustine Munson and Mary Mead. They were known as Gus and Polly, by the way. And Marvin was the grandson of Jesse Munson, you see up in the top left-hand corner, and his wife, Miriam Rowley. Now, Jesse and Miriam were two of the founding members of the Granville community, and they brought with them the largest family. So just in terms of full disclosure, I am also direct descendants from Jesse and Miriam. They are my 5th great-grandparents, but I want you to know that there are more than 1,000 of us, so that's not really a claim to fame, right? They had 11 children, then they had 20 grandchildren, and when you go down the generations, we have about 2,000, maybe just barely less than 2,000, if everybody had an average of 2.3 children, right? And many of these families had more than that, and occasionally someone had fewer than that. But there are more than 1,000 of us in my generation that can claim Jesse and Miriam as 5th great-grandparents. So, yeah, not such a it doesn't put me up on any kind of a pedestal. But Lorinda's mother was Emma Sabin Culbertson over here on the right-hand side, and her father was Robert Culbertson. Her mother was Rhoda Jane Lamson. Once in a while, you see that name spelled with a B. That's because Emma herself spelled it with a B on the death certificate, but in every other location, I mean, the spelling was not particularly consistent, but also that was a different last name. So if you are a person that tracks these kinds of things. And Marvin and Emma, they married in 1850. I think I have a slide for this. Yeah, they married in 1850. They had 8 children, and Lorinda, here you see her at about age 16, was the second of those 8 children. They lived in a house that was built in 1810 by Jesse, their grandfather, and the children's great grandfather, and it was on Centerville Street, which is Newark Granville Road. Right? And it's written about by Bushnell, not in any extremely large way, but it's mentioned and referenced, and so we have some clue about where the house was and what it looked like, and what it was built out of. Marvin, by the way, is claiming in every census that he's a farmer, but I just want to tell you something about Marvin. He he went to Miami University and he studied law. Now you didn't have to have there was no law degree, there was no bar exam. You didn't even have to have a college education to practice law in the 19th century. All you had to do was read, do a lot of reading, find somebody that would sponsor you, ask them eventually if you could please start practicing law, right? And so you were more or less apprenticed into the law. But my point here is that lawyers made 3 times as much as farmers in central Ohio in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. 3 times as much as farmers. So the fact that he listed for the census that he was a farmer all the time doesn't really capture what he did for a living and why he was able to amass such a fortune. And in addition to that, I think that fortune was likely passed down to his children, which you'll see when you see what Lorinda was able to do with her life. Bushnell also, by the way, confirms the fact that he was a lawyer. He calls him the Honorable Marvin Munson, and he says M.M. Munson, Esquire. He names several times and references several times. And he said, and this is a quote, he's a resident in the village and he attends to the law business. So why he told the census people that he was a farmer, I'm not sure. I don't know. All right, Lorinda, marriage and family. Now, Lorinda had already graduated from the Granville Female Seminary, the Granville Female College, and she had already spent a year teaching when she married. And then she married Charles Webster Bryant, who, if you happen to be new to this information, he is one of the founders of the Granville Historical Society. Charles was raised as an only child. He did have an older brother who died when he was quite young, and so Charles was raised as an only child, and he was raised in Alexandria until he was 17, at which point they moved to Granville. Charles and Lorinda married in 1875. He was 26, she was 20, and they lived at 240 East College Street, which happens to be the home of Mike and Janine Flood. And I wanted to mention that the books along the countertop are all books that Janine allowed me to borrow to bring here so that you could take a look at them tonight. These are all books that were written by Lorinda Bryant. Right? Yeah, she wrote about 20. We've got about 8 or 9 of them here. I think maybe 9. So after they were married, after the 2 of them were married, they had 2 children. Fitch Culbertson Bryant was their first child, born just about a year after they were married. And I love the fact that his names are the maiden names of his 2 grandmothers, the maiden names of his grandmothers, right? So now we already have a woman, Lorinda, who's thinking about passing along the namesake and making sure that those names get recycled in the family, right? So that they understand where they came from. And then 4 years later, they had their second child, Miriam Joanna Bryant. And she was named, you know this already now, after her great-great-grandmother. Yeah? Yeah. Now, I'm going to jump to one of the punchlines so that you understand why I'm not going to speak very much about Miriam. It just turns out that it's a little out of chronological order to say this, but I want you to know that Miriam died both suddenly and tragically of pneumonia when she was only 12 years old. At the home of, the newspaper article said, at the home of Mrs. Hayes. And I'm going to explain to you who Mrs. Hayes was. It was at the home of Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Hayes was not still alive. Marion was likely living at her aunt's home with her first cousin once removed. I'm going to show you some of those slides, but they're not here. I think they're in a minute. So I'll get back to showing you that relationship. Let me just make sure I didn't. Yeah, they're not here. I'm going to show you that relationship. But at any rate, Lorinda was out of town when that happened. She had actually moved out of town to be teaching somewhere. So we have a 10-year-old that moved in with her great aunt, and 2 years later she died of pneumonia with an illness that only lasted a couple of days, about 2 days. So that's why there are not very many stories about Miriam. And now a small bit about Charles, because I'd really rather talk about Lorinda. 3 years ago, Teresa Overholzer she's the archivist here, and she wrote a really lovely story about Charles for the Historical Times. And I just wanted to recommend that you consider picking up, maybe joining the Historical Society. They're not paying me to say this, but there's really, really great quarterlies that come out, and this story has lots of detail. It's really lovely. And among other things, Teresa mentions that Charles is known for owning the drugstore. He was 24 at that time. Spearheading the waterworks system. He was 36 at the time. And for founding the Granville Historical Society with 2 other people. But I want us to take a look at what Bushnell says about Charles for just a minute, because I'm going to bring your attention again to who Lorinda was. Bushnell says he was a student of the university until infirmity of the eyes obliged him to cease from study. He then engaged in civil engineering, and then eventually he entered the drug business, qualifying himself as a pharmacist by a course of study. He went to college for 3 years, had to drop out, didn't finish the 4th year, became a pharmacist by a year-long course of study. Let's hold on to that for just a second. And the second paragraph from Bushnell, he had a remarkable penchant for genealogical studies, and he kept up an extensive correspondence in pursuit of facts with an interest that knew no impatience. It was supposed he had his labors for this history nearly completed, but no trace of finished work can be found. Now, this little piece, by the way, we kind of know because Bushnell had intended for this book, History of Granville, to come out in 1880. And then he found out that Charles Bryant was working on genealogy as well. And so they divided up the tasks. And Bushnell was going to work on sort of the Granville overall, and Bryant was going to do the genealogy of the residents here. And he had 2,400 leaves of notes that he had taken about that. But he died in 1885. Before that he died in 1886. They got together in 1885. They were supposed to be publishing, and Bryant died. So Bushnell went ahead and published in 1889. So, but what I want you to ponder is this. If his eyesight kept him from completing college, but a year later he could read for the pharmaceutical license, and if he knew no impatience, but left no trace of any kind of finished work out of 2,400 sleeves, I ask for you to take a reflective moment to consider, the undocumented support that an educated, competent, intelligent wife like Lorinda might have contributed. And there's going to be a reason for us to think about that. Charles died of typhoid fever, and he died not being the beneficiary of the safe water for Granville, that safe water system that he had helped to put in place. He'd helped to put that in place by gathering about 7 men, and they had conversations about what to do and how to do it, and they got actually quite a lot done. But he died of typhoid fever in spite of that. And Lorinda was then widowed at age 31. So, although she had been a stay-at-home mother and had 2 small children, ages 10 and 5, she first took over running the Granville drugstore, in which Charles had an ownership interest. And in 1942, The Newark Advocate article says about this, with unflinching courage, Mrs. Bryant took charge of the drugstore, though she scarcely knew the rudiments of pharmacy. Now, I don't know what your silent reflective moment was a second ago, but in mine, I was like, I bet she knew quite a bit about that. She already had a degree, she'd already been teaching, she probably did the reading, right? And she was able to take over that store and turn everything around. All evidence points, circumstantial though it may be, that she probably had some idea. And then the advocate continued to say, eager to increase her knowledge, she promptly enrolled in the Chicago College of Pharmacy and became the first woman pharmacist in Ohio and the second in the United States. She continued her scientific study at Denison and later took special courses in science at Cornell. I'm going to guess smooth sailing. That's my guess. Right? Now, not only did she take advantage of the educational resources in Granville and in the surrounding area, but she also had discovered that she actually thrived in that arena. She thrived as a woman scientist, and she thrived in women's education. And this is where we're going to start to see her make her mark. Only 4 years after Charles died, when her children were 13 and 19, she was chosen as head of the science department of Ogontz College. Now, I actually have, I stand corrected if I'm wrong here, but I think she was at Ogontz, the college that it was a school for elite school for high school students for women. I don't think it was the Ogontz College that popped up later. I think that they were on the same ground, and the Ogontz is the name of a region, so that word was used over and over again. It wasn't a person's last name. But I think this was Ogontz School for Young Ladies, actually, where she was, so we'll see. But she had left her daughter, she had left Miriam in Granville with relatives. Because it gets so convoluted when you're just visiting, I'm just going to show you. This is her Marvin Morgan, Lorinda's dad. He was the youngest of 5 children. This is Lorinda, the person we're talking about. She left Miriam with her Aunt Mary, Lorinda's Aunt Mary, and with Emma Jewett. Emma Jewett is the daughter of her Aunt Lorinda, her namesake. Right? And Emma Jewett's mother had died. She was an only child, and her mother had died. Her father was still alive. Roland Chapin Jewett was still alive, but Emma was raised then by Mary. Mary Munson, by the way, was married to a guy named Byron Hayes, and he died about a year after they married, and she never got remarried, and they didn't have any children. Right? So Lorinda knew that Emma was being raised by Mary. Emma was 17 when her mother died, so she wasn't young. And when she left to go teach at that girls' school, she left Miriam with Mary and Emma in the house together. Right? So when she died, Mary was 77. When Miriam died, Mary was 77. Emma was about 42. Miriam was 12. So you've got 3 generations of women. But you see that one of the things they're learning even through this tragedy is that women help other women. Maybe like too much detail, but I love figuring out like who at the home of Mrs. Hayes. Wait, Mrs. Hayes was already dead. So, all right. So she traveled. One of the things Lorinda did, back to Lorinda, is that she traveled every summer, not for a week or two, not the kinds of vacations we might take. She traveled for months. So she would leave the United States in June, and she'd come back in September or October or November. Untethered to the traditional stay-at-home mom kinds of activities. And then the last thing I wanted to add was she ended up opening, just so I can throw it in, she ended up opening a Montrose School for Girls in South George, New Jersey, and that school was only open for 6 years. So while she was interested in women's education, and she did have that capacity to create this kind of institutional support for it, the school didn't stay open very long, and so she actually wasn't tethered to that for a long time. All right, Fitch. Now I want to get back to her son, Fitch and the travel agency. It should be a Saturday morning cartoon, don't you think? Fitch and the travel agency. So for just a minute, I want to hear about the supporting actor in Lorinda's saga. This is her son, Fitch. Remember, her parents have died. Her daughter has died. Her husband has died. Right, all of these things have happened. Fitch was a tall, slender, light-haired, blue-eyed manager of a publishing house, and he had married Carolyn T. Brown of Deposit, New York, on June in 1907. Carrie was, wait for it, a high school science teacher and an author. Fitch married his mother, right, the younger version of his mother. And she ended up dying tragically as well. Oops, sorry, that's my next slide. She ended up dying tragically as well of anemia. They had been married slightly less than 4 years. And so Fitch, during his courtship and when he was married to her, this is the time that Lorinda wrote this first book. So when you have a chance, get up and take a look at this. This is the book she was writing when Fitch was dating Kara and then married Carrie. And then Carrie died, and then Fitch moved back in. So you'll see a little pause in her work, right? While she's trying to figure things out again. But Fitch and Carrie had moved to Boston. They were managing their lives, and when she died, he moved back to Brooklyn, and she moved back in with him in Brooklyn, or maybe he moved in with her. I don't know which of those was the case. And 7 years later, he registered for the service because of World War I. It was 1918 now, and he listed Lorinda as his next of kin. That makes perfect sense, of course, but they were still living in the same apartment in Manhattan, in Brooklyn. Manhattan Avenue is a big street in Brooklyn. Sorry. Then he remarried, and this time he married a girl from Red Hook, New York. Her name was Bertha Cookingham, and she was a graduate of Hunter College and the daughter of the only doctor in town. And on their wedding day, he was 42 and she was 39. Pictured here, we see Bertha in the top, flanked on either side by her brothers Harris and Barton. And then her sister Mary and her sister's husband Horace Coons are below with their children. And all of them are centered around Dr. and Mrs. Cookingham. Fitch and Bertha were married 10 years after this photo. This is the only photo I've found of Bertha's whole family. Fitch and Bertha were married 10 years later than that. And they never had any children. But I'm going to show you his passport picture in the same era so that you kind of have some sense of who she is. We can kind of Photoshop him into that picture. When Fitch retired in 1939, he had been associated with a travel agency for 25 years, Thomas Cook and Associates. And one might imagine it was this affiliation that permitted Lorinda the opportunity to travel so that she was able to write the books that she wrote. But in fact, I believe it was the other way around. Right? Lorinda had already been in Europe every summer for the whole last decade of the 19th century. And we know from passport applications that she traveled for months at a time. And he didn't start at the travel agency until after he returned from Boston after Carrie's death. And he moved to Thomas Cook out of the publishing industry himself. He moved to Thomas Cook in 1914. So Fitch probably followed his mother's lead into his love of travel. By the way, just one little tip. Lorinda has a reputation, was printed in the Dayton Daily News, it must be true, that she traveled around the world 3 full times after the age of 70. And that was quite a feat for a single woman in that era. So I think that's kind of fascinating. Now, empty nest, becoming an author. What did all the travel and all that independence and frankly all that affluence yield for our central Ohio woman? Brief as it was, Fitch's marriage to Carrie really afforded her sufficient time, right, away from being the mom full time to Fitch, on her other passion, the one we most remember her for, which is writing. Her first book, History of Painting, the book that I picked up and showed you over there, was published in 1907, and by the time of her death, she had authored over 20 books, several of them with revised editions. And among them were these. I don't expect you to be able to see this whole list up there, but she covered topics of painting, children's books, Bible stories, pictures from various specific countries, and then you see down here, starting here in 1922, she started focusing more or less on children's books. Right? So a children's book of celebrated pictures, children's book of celebrated buildings, the children's book of celebrated towers, right? And we have many of those books here. In a brief review in the New York Times, the Times editor said, the work was written not for those who have some knowledge and appreciation, but for those, especially women, who know little about art or artists. So, all right, so that's the way they talked. But I think it's important to realize that she was so dedicated to women's education all the way along. Now, I want to talk just for 1 second. I want to get you to go into your mind's eye and think, especially for those that this applies to. I know that won't be everyone in here. What were you doing in the phase of your life between the ages of 30 and 50? What's that phase in your life, 30 to 50? What were we doing in that phase of our life? Like what was important to us? How were we making decisions? If you're over 30, you can participate. Have an idea of what you yourself were doing between 30 and 50? 20 years may seem like a really long period of time, but for the vast majority of the women in this audience, there was a lot of focus on family. A lot of focus. I don't mean that's all we were doing, but there's a lot of focus on family. And I would guess that it's the phase in our lives where we were raising our children, but not Lorinda. She was not doing that. Literally, within that score of years, everything changed for her. Her husband died. She straightened out the pharmacy business. She got a degree in science. She started traveling each and every summer by herself, by the way, without her children. She moved to Philadelphia to teach. She left her daughter behind. Then her daughter died. She continued traveling consistently. Her father died. She moved to South Orange. She opened up a girls' school. Then the girls' school closed. Then she went to Bermuda. Then her mom died. Her son moved to Boston. Then his wife died. And now she's back home in Brooklyn. That is a lot of change to happen in 20 years. That's a lot of, it takes a lot of fortitude, I think, to survive that kind of change in those years. But because Lorinda had created her author self largely in New York, her deep roots in Granville might have dissipated. But a year after her mother died, she applied for a passport to travel to, I can't remember where she was traveling to, but probably Europe. But at any rate, she cited New York as her permanent address, but she had the passport sent to Granville for her retrieval. I think that it indicated a continuing and deep attachment to her birth home. Of course, her sister Mary was here with Mary's husband, Frank Follett, but that was it. I mean, Granville was likely the place where she felt like this was the safe space. This is where she was raised. This is her birth home. The other places were also travel adventures, right? The move to Brooklyn, the move to she lived in the Bronx, she moved in Brooklyn, then she moved into Manhattan. These are probably travel ventures. Granville was the place she thought of as home. And she had come to know herself here, and the place whose values she shared were here, right? So the women, the education, and the independence, those three things are patterns throughout her history. With her husband's commitment to the community and the community's commitment to women's education, the ownership of the drugstore that inspired her to return to school, 2,400 leaves of facts, genealogical notes left behind unfinished, and the deep friendships that she had built here, in particularly Creighton Black, who's another one of the founders, who was a trustee, and her will. All kinds of details continue to point to how meaningful Granville was for her. So while she remained living in New York, she maintained those Midwestern ties. And now I want to turn to the portrait itself. Let's see. There's quite a bit of mystery around the portrait. It's, again, if you turn around, you can see it right there. We'll look at it live, but there's a lot of mystery around this portrait, which was called A Study in Black and Gold. But part of the mystery is not who was the artist, right? We know who the artist was. It was painted by Clara Mamrie Norton. And Norton was a landscape and portrait painter who had exhibited in the Corcoran Art Gallery in DC and the National Gallery of Design in New York, among many other places. And she received her professional training at the Hartford Art Society School and at the Boston Art and Music School, where as a student, she won a Page Traveling Scholarship. So the Bristol Historical Society confirms that she traveled to Europe for 2 years from 1902 to 1904. And on that scholarship as an art student, and she painted many of the master paintings, and indeed the scholarship itself is confirmed in Lorinda's 1917 book, where she writes about that in American Pictures and Their Painters. Clara was born in Burlington, Connecticut. She was the oldest of 3 girls. Her parents were Alfred Norton and Adeline Elizabeth Lowry Norton. And she had a younger sister, Luella, and then a much younger, 5-year younger sister, Mary Elizabeth. The girls lived with their parents, all 3 of them, into adulthood. They lived on North Street in Bristol. But then Clara set off for Europe in that 1902 to 1904 time frame. And when she returned, she and her little sister, Mary, moved into an apartment in New York City on the Upper West Side. Let me show you this apartment.
Wow. It's like your place.
Right, exactly. Thank you for having that response.
Almost.
Is this a in the studio apartment? Look up these studio apartments right now. A studio apartment in this building right now goes for $900,000. A studio apartment, $900,000. Studio apartment is about the size of this room, and maybe a little smaller than this room. Right? No small feat that they lived in this lovely, lovely apartment. That, well, eventually, we know from just at the close of the war in 1918, 5 years after her father had died, I'm talking about Clara's father, Mary had married a guy named Leslie Pond. Rather quickly, I might add, just for the gossipy side of it, she was pregnant when they got married, and he was 10 years younger, and he was a soldier, and there was a war, and anyway, so Mary married him. They both put down on their wedding license, by the way, that this is the apartment that they both lived in. So either all 3 of them were living there, or Clara said, okay, I'm out of here. Like, you 2 are taking up too much space. I'm out of here. I don't know which of those that was. But Clara herself, artists were concerned about, moved back to Bristol to move in with her aging mother. I say aging, but her mother was only 69, and Clara was 44, and her mother needed someone to move in with her to help her. So there you go. Clara remained a resident of Bristol for the rest of her life. She died in 1941. Now we know from the date on under the signature of our portrait, I don't think I have a close-up of it here, but you can see it live, that our painting was done in 1916. And the Historical Society acquired it as a gift from the Granville Public Library, who had acquired it as a gift from Lorinda's son Fitch sometime after her death, and sometime before GHS had a permanent collection collection's location. That was 1955. And by the way, Cynthia just did a fantastic addendum to the Clara Sennett essay that just came out maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something, that describes when GHS was able to acquire its own space. So this painting came to us after Lorinda died in 33 and before we had space of our own in 55. That's a pretty wide spread. But I'm not talking about when it was GHS. I'm talking about when it made its way back to Granville. Right? Now, our portrait had this little insignia on the back. This is the thing that I said, of course we know what her name was, but like who really was she? What was her life like? I love that all of that was written on the back because it helped us immensely. And the 1920 date that you see up there is not the date of the painting, it's the date of the exhibition that the painting was in. The painting was done in 1916. And we also discovered in the restoration process, and Fred will talk maybe a little more about this, that scratched into the frame was perhaps the date 1916, perhaps, and the words Licking County, or Licking CO for county. So there's a guess that this might be the original frame that the painting was in. Now, I want you to take another just little pause and ask yourself, when you look at this painting, like, what do you see? What you know about Lorinda now, what do you see in this painting? Isn't it interesting that it's hard to see the chair? When you look at it live and in person, you can see the chair she's sitting on so much better. It's always better to see a painting live than a picture of a painting. Anybody have any response to this? Self-confidence, determination, a seriousness, some impatience, perhaps. What do I see in it? Money. You see money. Oh yeah. She was definitely a woman of means. This is why I told you that Marvin, although he listed himself as a farmer. Yeah. And he had 8 kids to take care of too. So yeah, I think the painting itself shows a woman who's independent, who's comfortable, who's satisfied. She looks completely content. She had created quite a nourishing life for herself, following multiple interests, developing both a critical and a creative career. She was at one point a young wife and mother, but then a pharmacist, a science teacher, a founder of young women's educational institutions, and finally, for a quarter of a century, she had found her passion. She wrote many books about great works of art and architecture. So I just want to conclude by saying in 1929, same era, 1929, Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own, in which she argues that for a woman to be a successful writer, she needs to have 500 pounds a year, gotta multiply that for 2025, and a room of her own to ensure financial independence and freedom from societal constraints. That was exactly what Lorinda was able to accomplish for herself. After quite a bit of personal tragedy, she lived a privileged existence that was full and glorious. She was a portrait of resilience. Thank you. And now I want to turn to Fred, whom we are lucky enough to have in the audience tonight, and ask Fred if you want to talk a bit about the restoration process?
Yeah. That was great, Gill. Very interesting.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks a lot. You know,
He has
I
one.
do.
Yeah, Fred, do you want to plug in or not? Yeah?
Yes, I want to plug in. I'm glad I can plug in. I didn't know I'd be able to plug in. So yeah. You know, interesting. What's the title of the painting? Study in Black and Gold.
Study in Black and Gold.
What's the title of Whistler's Mother? Study in Black and Gray. I think there's a
the
parallel.
affluence that you're talking about.
I think there's a parallel there. I do. And also, when I first saw this painting, it looked like Boston School
Yes.
to me.
Yes.
Which, hey, there's my family. We're all pretending to look at the eclipse. Yes, we are pretending, by the way. Or we're all really dumb. Okay, I might have to cancel this. And I wasn't prepared to use this, so you'll have to excuse me while I figure out where I am. But I did put these images together. Don't allow. Okay. So when I was given the painting, first of all, I'm Fred Fochman. Let me start there. And thanks very much for inviting me to be here, Nanette and Gill and everybody who was involved. I really appreciate it. And when I was first asked to look at the painting, did I look at the painting before? Like, was there a year or two before that I actually saw this and then came back? Do you remember?
Yep.
Is that what happened?
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, it had a sense to me of sort of that New England, that sort of Boston school, and it was obviously, dark. And the chair that you referenced was particularly dark and really wasn't overly visible. I mean, you knew it was there, but the nuance of the way that's painted wasn't revealed until it was cleaned. Yeah. So when I clean a painting, the word clean really has two meanings. The first meaning is that there's just like any surface that's 100 years old, it's dirt. There's soil on it, like a wall. And essentially a painting is on a wall, so it takes on the same, issues that a wall would take on. So cleaning a painting means removing that soil, but it can also mean taking away what has become toned varnish. Now, when this painting was painted over 100 years ago, the varnishes of choice would have been Damar or maybe shellac, but the nature of all those varnishes at that time is that they weren't particularly purified. So inevitably, they're going to darken. And so when they darken, they take on this kind of yellow-brown quality. So when I first started to clean it, I was reluctant to get into the varnish layer because when I assessed the painting, a couple of things. I think there was 7 tears. I may be wrong, but I think it was 7 tears. And some lost paint on the front. And also what we call the canvas fold. So the part of the canvas that rolls over the edges and is nailed had aged and become brittle and had broken free as well. So when a painting's in that condition, I'm faced with a decision. The decision is, do I just repair what's broken, or do I do what's typically done, which is reline the entire painting? Mm-hmm. And what that means is you take that old canvas and you attach it to an entirely new canvas. And by doing that, you fortify the canvas. But in my experience, anytime that I can do less to a painting, that's my goal. I could have relined that painting, and what would have happened to that painting when I relined it is it would have taken on a little bit of a different character, because when you reline a painting, it becomes a little bit more flat, and it loses just a little something to me. So when I can avoid that, I do avoid that. And in this case, I thought I could fix this without relining. So what you're looking at there, what looks like bad birth defects, is actually me checking into what's going to work to clean the painting. So those little marks on her forehead and on her cheek are actually just areas where I've removed surface soil, and I've recognized that I'm going to have to remove varnish, which I don't really want to do, because that's an entirely different process. It moves from using gentle soaps to using caustic solvents. And the painting is at some degree of risk when that is happening to a painting. In a painting of this age, 1917, it's old enough that in my world, it's called color fast, because oil paint is just linseed oil or something like linseed oil and pigment. That's all it is. And over time, that linseed oil hardens and becomes so hard that the painting becomes tougher and frankly easier to take care of. A painting from 1960 is a hazardous project, because that paint is generally not color fast. But in a painting of this age, the paint becomes tougher and it becomes a little bit easier to work with. So my decision was, I'm going to clean it. I'm going to take the varnish off. I'm going to start taking the varnish off where it's most critical, and that's where her skin was. So it's going to be her face. And this is what you're looking at is me slowly removing the varnish and revealing Clara Norton, right?
No,
No, Clara Norton was the painter, right?
Yes, yes.
So revealing Clara Norton's work. And by the way, as I'm looking at Clara Norton, the painter's work, I'm realizing that, can you guys see how textural the paint is in her forehead?
Uh-huh.
When I see that in my world, that usually says to me that somebody has painted on the painting. That challenged me. I wasn't sure that was original to the painting. I was restoring an Alice Shilley painting. Alice Shilley was a Columbus artist. I was restoring an Alice Shilley painting one time, and I had cleaned off all of this big, bright red dress and a cat on a stool, and I finally got to her face, and I removed all the stuff from her face, and it had been completely repainted by somebody. And that happens because oftentimes people don't think to clean these paintings. They doctor them by putting paint on top. And in, who knows, 1935, no one cared about an Alice Shilley painting to the point that they weren't worried about it. So then I'm sort of tasked with, how do I get that off of this painting without ruining the original paint that's underneath? Mm-hmm. So when I saw this painting and I was working on this painting, all of a sudden I thought, oh no, I think I'm going to have paint on paint. That was not the case. What I had instead was a vigorous stroke with a lot of paint and a lot of, like, almost as if the painter put it down and pulled the brush off to leave this very coarse texture on the painting. Another example of sort of cleaning her hand. And there it is again with some stuff on her face. So, oh, and here you can see, I'm sorry to jump around. You can see where I've cleaned this right side, and I've cleaned, and where it's dark still, that rectangle has not been cleaned yet. But this is dirt. This is not varnish removal. I'm still playing around with dirt removal. I'm playing around with varnish and dirt on her face, but the rest of the painting, I want to try and keep it to just dirt. Well, none of that worked out. And when you do restoration, there are no two paintings that are the same, ever. It's like there's no handbook. It's you learn and you do, and sometimes you take a risk and you do that conservatively, but that's what you have to do. So eventually I thought, I got to go all in on this. I got to remove the varnish. And I took the varnish off. And when I took it off, it looked like tar coming off of this painting. It was tarred and it was granular when it came off. So, but I knew when I was doing it that it was the right decision because it was revealing a gorgeous painting. You know, this painting is really dark. But look at what's happening with her face now. You have the left side, our left side is still has the varnish, but that right side now is being revealed. Look at all that nuanced color, the pinks and the reds that are showing up in her eye. And it was at this point that I also realized that is that painter's paint. I'm not going to have to mess around with trying to take off somebody else's work. But these are the things that you run into when you're doing a project like this. I mean, I can look at it all day, but until I start, I really don't know what I'm going to encounter. So ultimately, I was able to get all of that material off, and it became like this. So now that painting is fully stripped of the varnish and the dirt, and I've probably washed it with a neutralizer or mineral spirits to take a picture of it, because if you saw it without me doing that, it would look like someone took white chalk and covered the whole painting in white chalk, because oxidation happens when you clean a painting, particularly when you take varnish off. It can be kind of scary to look at, but when you put a neutralizer or mineral spirits on there, it shows you what the painting is going to look like when it's varnished. And so the next thing I had to do was figure out what I was going to do with all the tears and the bubbles, the pulls on the side. So I remember I turned this painting upside down, which is what I have to do to get all the junk out of the bottom stretcher. And I think smallpox came out of there. I'm not really sure. It's a little frightening what came out of there. This thing had lived kind of a rough life. It had a lot of, it had pine needles, I recall, coming out of there. And so then I was sort of, so I have a situation now where I have, I don't know, I think 7 tears. So what I do with those tears, because I'm not relining the paint, is I actually patch them. And when I patch them, and I'm going to flip ahead here for a second, I think I have a picture of what that would look like. Bear with me. Yeah. So what you're looking at here, like underneath those keys in that corner, that's me trying to utilize old linen that matches the patina of the linen of the painting. And what I do is I take that little piece of linen and I'm going to attach it to the back of the painting, and the wound in the front of the painting should pull back as I put the adhesive between the patch material and the back of the canvas. And I actually use something, it's a sort of the most contemporary material called Viva, and what it is, it's a heat-sensitive tissue. It kind of feels like saran wrap. And when it's heated, it melts into the surface and it melts into the patch. But because it's heat treated, it's archival. So I can actually apply enough heat and remove that patch and the adhesive entirely without impacting the painting. Is this super boring,
No.
by the way? Because I think it is, and you're being nice. Anyway, I think I did 7 patches like this. And there's a nuance to patching, particularly in an old painting like this, because that linen is very fragile. If I was to take a little piece of that edge and kind of do this with my fingers, it would just turn to powder in my hands. So you have to be really careful about patching, because what happens when you patch a painting is that patch wants to telegraph to the surface of the painting. It wants to show up as an edge line around the patch. So when you're doing this kind of patching, what you try to do is isolate within that patch exactly where the tear is, use as little adhesive as possible, and then leave a lot of perimeter around the inside edge of that patch where there's no adhesive, so you don't get a contact ring or something like that on the front of the painting. And the older the painting is, the trickier that becomes, because that linen is so brittle, it wants to grab the tension of my new patch and telegraph that to the front. So, and you can see her face on the back of this canvas because it required so much solvent to actually remove all of that old varnish and dirt that particular area shows up with sort of a negative image. Actually, it's kind of cool when you look at it like that. You can see the whole painting through there. So essentially, that is, in a nutshell, what I did to this painting. And I remember, and I don't know if I have a good picture at the end, I was not prepared to show these. The other thing that I do, because of that torn canvas edge, is there's a lot of places where the relationship between the canvas and that fold is torn. So when I run into that, I take a piece of canvas just like this, and I slip it in where the tear is, and let it roll just a little bit over the canvas to the front, and then I use that heat-treated material to grab that and to heat that, and then I can pull on that and get it back to the tension that it should have. And by the way, this painting in 1917 was painted on a stretcher system, and typically paintings like this were painted on something called a strainer, the difference being that a stretcher system has these little wooden keys in the corner, and they're essentially there to permit you to tap on them and create tension in the painting surface. Because over time, what happens is, with heat and humidity and cold, that canvas flexes and flexes, and it starts to loosen itself on that frame. So stretcher systems like this are designed to allow you to tap that and rejuvenate the surface of the painting. So there's several areas in the painting that have these little pull tab patches as well as the patches on the surface. And then once I get those patches in place, I do this, and you can see all those little white marks are areas where I have filled the front of the painting with either beeswax or something called acrylic modeling compound. And what I do is I fill those voids several times, and then I essentially sand away that material until you can't see it in a raking light. It's like people say, which restoration, are you wearing like a jeweler's loop and a 2-hair paintbrush? And I'm like, no, it's like beating a fender out of a car. Because the truth is, this thing needs to be really manhandled to get it back to where I can put paint on it, make that stuff disappear. These little things that I've filled out here, if I don't perfectly make those blend into the surface of the canvas, they're going to stand out when I go to paint them. So the real job isn't putting a little bit of paint on the painting. The job is getting all of this stuff tight again and getting all of these areas of repair where they'll disappear when I hold the painting up against, I call it a raking light. But if you take anything and sort of hold it up to a light where you can sort of see the surface, not the image, but the surface itself, If I lose the surface, then that means it's ready to paint. And at that point, I paint. And when you're doing something as dark as this painting, it's usually multiple small coats of paint sort of fishing around for the blend of browns, reds, blacks, whatever it is that kind of makes that painting, gives it its character, because it's not black. And the quality of the linen also has a responsibility in how those colors come through in the painting. So for me, doing this painting was like many paintings of this vintage. It's a little risky. I try to be really thoughtful about doing as little as possible to the painting, because I just think that's the best way to approach what I do. And I do a lot of work. I work for the State House, and I do all their stuff. And so I'm used to working on paintings of age, except most of the time it's a dead white guy on a brown background. Like pretty much all of them are dead white guys. So any questions about it? Yeah.
What kind of paint do you use, since you're not a painter but an architect?
I am a painter.
I know, but you're restoring it rather than being a
I paint with oil paint. Yeah, I mean, if someone wanted me to paint with water media, I could. But there's a difference between conservation and restoration. And restoration is really asking me to return a painting to a state where you don't see the conservation. Conservation with water media on an oil painting is going to reveal where the work has been repaired. And so that's the difference. So I use judiciously, but I use oil paint. Yeah.
Then what you said you put something over the surface yet?
The varnish? Yeah, I varnished this with an archival varnish called Gamsol. And it's archival because if someone were to splatter that painting with mineral spirits, it would actually remove that varnish. So traditional varnishes are a lot harder than that, and they take solvents to remove, like let's call it shellac. So shellac, which is a very common varnish historically, shellac is just a particular beetle. And a particular part of that beetle is pulverized into a powder, and then that powder is floated in denatured alcohol. And so when you buy a can of shellac, you're buying mostly just a can of denatured alcohol with a little bit of media, and the media is actually pulverized bug parts, quite literally. But it's more purified than it used to be. And when you remove shellac from a painting, the only way you can take it off is with denatured alcohol. That's the only way. Questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the way that oil together?
The actual paint color itself?
Yeah.
So what's going to happen when I put the first piece of paint on this painting, on those marks, they're white. They're white as snow. And if you look at this painting and you look at it in person, you can see that other than the areas in her face and hands where there's a lot of opacity in the paint strokes, the rest of this painting is super thin. I mean, there's very little paint on this painting. As a matter of fact, if we were to get up and look at this, I will show you where the ground, the linen, is still exposed in part of this painting because the paint is so thin. So I can't come in and glob on a hunk of paint because you're going to see it. So what I have to do is first I have to kill the white. So I try to come in with something that to me represents where I want to end up, usually a little darker than that, just to get started and start to cover that white. And then I'll put a second coat on that starts to get a little bit closer to the edge of the repair. And like I said, sometimes it's 3 or 4, or sometimes several more little passes with the paint. And what I do is I usually wait a day or two between each of those so I get enough dryness. And knowing I was going to varnish this, I use a product called Liquin, which is a dryer. It's like a medium that's a dryer, and it has a little bit of shine. So I knew that whatever I did on my patch that produced a shine was going to be concealed by my varnish. But that's what it is. I'm sneaking up on those colors because I'm going to tell you that you count all those white spots, none of those were the same color. They're all different. And so finding that and then trying to let that settle into the painting so it's not conspicuous that's what I'm shooting for. And that's how I go about it. But if I was to measure the time I spent on this painting and the time I spent putting paint on this painting, 5%. is paint. 95% is everything else. Yeah. You know, I don't remember. I think I had figured that out when I first did it. And it's funny, how do you measure time with these things too? Because I might spend just 3 hours playing around with that paint color one day, and then I leave it for a week before I get back to it, and then I might spend half a day doing some other part of it. So I'm a self-employed guy, and so my studio is full of projects all the time. Easily 40 hours is in this painting, I'd say. Yeah. It's a great painting, though. It is a beautiful painting. And I love that sort of New England school. I'm a huge fan of that. And so it was fun to work on. But it was also like, you know, a little, when you're working on it, like, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to make this work? So that's kind of the nature of the business stuff. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Fred.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah. It's a great painting. Using that frame was a great choice. Salvaging the picture frame.
Yeah.
We're really lucky that there was someone that didn't do a face at all. You know, you didn't have to do much in painting there at all back then.
Right.
We'll